Hello, this is our Sunday School lesson review for Joshua chapter 7. In Joshua chapter 6, last week we talked about the great victory that the Hebrews had at Jericho, obviously led by the hand of God. But in Joshua 6:18, we see the command of God that the Hebrews were not to take anything for the spoils of war. They were allowed to take items of gold and silver and bronze and iron, and they were to give that directly to the treasury of God. But personally, no one was allowed to take anything for spoils of war to keep for themselves. We get here to chapter 7, and the first word in chapter 7 is the word but. So we have this great victory in chapter 6, but the narrative changes in the first word of chapter 7, and it says that the children of Israel committed a trespass, the accursed thing. And we see about this man named Achan, who we later see in the chapter had admitted to taking some of the items from Jericho, which we'll get to in a moment. But the narrative changes there in chapter 7, verse 1. In chapter 7, verse 2, we read about Joshua sending spies to Ai, which was about 10 miles west of Jericho. Ai was about 2,300 feet higher in elevation than Jericho, so Ai was built on a hill to be able to, and they were able to see down to Jericho from their vantage point, and they knew what had happened to Jericho, perhaps just the week prior. I don't think a whole lot of time passed between the time that Jericho was taken and the time that Ai was attacked in chapter 7. But the spies go to Ai. They come back to Joshua and say, there's no need for all of us to go and fight this battle. There's not very many there. They're not very well fortified. And so let's just send 2,000 or 3,000 soldiers to fight against Ai. And it says in verse 4 that Joshua sends 3,000 men to Ai to fight. And it says in verse 4 that they fled before the men of Ai. And then it says in verse 5 that there were 36 of the Hebrews that were killed in this battle against Ai. And I honestly don't think that it was much of a battle. I think that the Hebrews were turned back long before they actually even took any type of a battle or siege against Ai. And we see 36 men were killed at this battle, if you want to call it that, at Ai. They returned back, and it says there in verse 5 that the hearts of the people melted and became as water. So they had lost all hope that the God that had delivered them from Egypt, and the God that had brought them across Jordan, and the God that helped or defeated at the Battle of Jericho, they've completely lost all hope. It says in verse 6 that Joshua rent his clothes and fell on his face before the Ark of the Covenant. We see here that Joshua, in proper mourning, was mourning this defeat and the loss of these men. But notice in verse 7, Joshua begins to blame God. And he says in verse 7, wherefore hast thou all brought this people over Jordan to deliver us into the hand of the Amorites to destroy us? So he's blaming God for this loss. And then he says, would to God we had been content to have dwelt on the other side of Jordan. So the same complaint that the Hebrews had lodged against God and Moses during the 40 years of wandering in the wilderness, Joshua now throws it up to God and says, wouldn't it just been better for you to have left us on the east side of the Jordan River? Why did you bring us over here if you weren't going to give us victory? And so Joshua turns to blame God, which is what we all tend to do when things don't go the way we hope that they do. And he mentions there in verse 8, what am I supposed to say when Israel turns their back against their enemies? And what am I supposed to do when our enemies are mocking you? And God tells Joshua in verse 10 to get up. Why are you laying on your face? And he tells Joshua in verse 11, Israel has sinned against me. God made a clear command in chapter 6 that Israel was not to take the spoils of war. And God tells Joshua, there is sin in the camp. There is someone in your camp that has sinned. And he commands Joshua to go find the man and to deal with the sin that is in the camp. And so we see here that Joshua tells the people in verse 13 to sanctify themselves, to prepare themselves for examination. And it says on the morning there in verse 16, it says in the morning, he began to call the tribes one by one, families one by one, households one by one. So he's going to go through this long interrogation of questioning each of the families of each of the household, or each of the households of each of the families of each of the tribes, to find the one that had sinned against God and had sinned against Israel. And this had to be a long, drawn-out process. You've got probably 3 million people. Perhaps you've got 1 million households. And so Joshua plans to go through them one by one. And it says there that he got to the family of Achan there in verse 17. And it's very specific. The son, it says here, the Achan, the son of Carmi, the son of Zabdi, the son of Zerah of the tribe of Judah. And so Achan is mentioned even back to his great-grandfather, and then obviously to the tribe that he belongs to. And in verses 19, 20, and 21, Achan admits to what he done, and he said in verse 21, or he says in verse 20, I have indeed sinned against the God of Israel. And he admits in verse 21 what he did. I saw among the spoils a goodly Babylonish garment. So out of the corner of his eye, maybe, he saw this colorful garment that had came all the way from Babylon. Perhaps I haven't looked to see, but it's several hundred miles from Jericho to Babylon. And I'm sure that this was a colorful garment, something that would be eye-catching. And so even in the battle of Jericho, Achan spots this, and so he takes it. It says that I found some silver and a wedge of gold. He says, I coveted them, and I took them, and I hid them in my tent. And so these things, the progression of sin in Achan, I saw, I coveted, I took, and I hid. And we all do that with our sin. We don't want anybody to know the sin in our life, but we should know and we should understand that we have sin. And we should want to confess sin. We should want to bring our sins before God. And when we first see this sign that we are going to fall into temptation, we need to run from it. But Achan, on the other hand, he gave in and he followed along on his sinful desires, his sinful lust that's in him, and he took of these things. And because he took of these things, Israel was defeated, the people had lost all hope, and 36 men were dead. It says there that once, in verse 22, once Achan admits to the taking of the goods, Joshua sends messengers into Achan's tent and finds them. Joshua then gathers Achan and his entire family and all of his livestock and all of his goods. And it says in verse 24 through 26 that Achan is stoned with stones, and the things that he had stolen was burned with fire. And then in verse 26, it says that a heap of stones was raised over Achan as a memorial and a remembrance that this man sinned against God and that God hates sin and that sin must be punished. Now today we realize that our sin was placed upon Christ, that his righteousness is imputed to us and our sin is imputed to him, and that Christ bore our sin. But we also know that in 1 John chapter 1, that if we say that we have no sin, we deceive ourselves. And it also says in 1 John chapter 1, verse 9, that if we confess our sin, he is faithful and just to forgive us our sin. And so we need to constantly have this desire to turn or run to God when faced with temptation. Instead of giving in and asking for forgiveness, we should run to Christ and ask for help in the time of temptation so that we don't give in. So we see here that God takes sin very seriously. Someone had to pay, and that man was Achan because of the sin that he did. And not only did he have to pay, but I believe the 36 men that were killed in the first battle of Ai were killed because of the sin that Achan had committed at Jericho. So with that, we'll close, and I wish you a good day. Thank you for watching.